The trouble is, I find inspirational talks a little bit difficult to digest, because I think to assume that you know so much that you can lecture other people on it is what diplomacy is not about. My son, when he found out that I was leaving him on Saturday, said, "But why are you going for an inspirational talk? Amma, didn't you always say they were quite stupid?" I do believe they're not, so I'm not going to give an inspirational talk. I'm going to talk from the, from the vantage point of a person who has been trying to do diplomacy in a world which is not very ready, or the world which has moved away from a world of diplomacy and finding solutions. And the world I feel today is a world in which we want to perpetrate problems and conflict and just be, give ourselves a heads up or, on it. So I'm just going to start by perhaps talking about what diplomacy is. Because if you want to talk about influence and the art of diplomacy, you have to first understand what diplomacy is, or what do we collectively understand by diplomacy. I myself was what I call an accidental diplomat, perhaps also an uncomfortable diplomat. But I do believe that I have been, over the years, becoming more and more of a passionate diplomat. And that has obviously much to do with the world around us. And the need for diplomacy, as it increases, the diplomacy in the world seems to be decreasing. What is good diplomacy? And after that, we're going to talk about the world that we live in. Because a lot of times, I think one mistake that most people make is that they assume that diplomacy functions at an alternate universe, or almost like we can do whatever we do in the world, do wars, never look back, but diplomacy will continue. And why is diplomacy not delivering? Well, the world is not giving the circumstances for diplomacy to function. And then perhaps, talk about what I think is the state of play of the world, and therefore, and what I believe is the state of play of diplomacy in the world today. And then end with what I hope will be a positive note, to give you two names we should all know as the great diplomats of this decade, perhaps, and hopefully be inspired by them. And those are the people I would like to encourage people to be inspired by. Now, if you ask me, okay, what is diplomacy? Diplomacy is not about winning. Diplomacy is also not about just being able to get your position agreed to, or get your model, functioning in the world, and that's great. And often diplomacy is misperceived to be, the ability to deceive people and to be able to, fool people into doing something that is not really in their interest. I believe that that is absolutely no way to conduct diplomacy, and if you're able to, you cannot fool all people for all time. So if that is your diplomacy, then very soon, whatever you've garnered, whatever you've achieved, will come falling down. We also have a tendency to overcomplicate things and make them so difficult that, normal people cannot understand what is actually happening. And we go like, oh yes, of course, you can't understand. This is far too complicated. It's a diplomatic world. It's the world of the nuances. The nuances are important, but what are the nuances achieving on the ground is perhaps even more important. Diplomacy to me is actually creating win-win. And if you are someone who is not able to move back from your position, then believe me, being a diplomat is not something that is your forte or something that you should be. And if you are someone who is not avoiding conflict but is actually becoming a perpetrator of conflict, then too you need to think very hard that is that diplomacy at all. I think diplomacy more than anything else is the wisdom to be able to give some to take some. Because if you only want to be the taker, you can be a hegemonic power, you can get your way, but clearly that way will not translate into something that will be, long-standing. I will just use a few words to define, to give you some features which I believe over time are important for diplomacy to function well in the world, in the region, in the country, because really we're all diplomats everywhere. Husband and wife, diplomatic, father and child, children, lot of diplomacy, yeah? In the world, in your houses, in your businesses, working with your co-workers, lot of diplomacy. But why should diplomacy be like something that we almost be like, oh, she's very diplomatic, oh, he's very diplomatic. It's almost like a negative thing, right? To me, diplomacy is not negative at all. It is to be able to give some, to take some. And that is something that is to be celebrated and not looked down upon. What is the first and foremost quality of being able to run good diplomacy or being a good diplomat? More than anything else, unselective, and please, I'm emphasizing the words unselective empathy. If you're sitting across the table from another person, another country, another region, and you are unable to have empathy for what they are going through and where their brief comes from, then you're just somebody who is a parrot who's repeating their own briefs and their own interests and their own whatever they want to achieve. You are clearly not somebody. And you know, I have read a lot. As I said, I'm somewhat a self-trained diplomat, assisted in a great way by my country and the great diplomats that my country has produced. But eventually, diplomacy has to come from within, from your heart, from what you see and what you want to be able to do. And reading a lot of books can help, put things out there, but eventually it's not theory which is going to help you. And that is why diplomacy is more of an art rather than a science. So empathy, unselective empathy, which means that your empathy for a certain caste, creed, color is not at a very high level. So if we think we are going to be selectively empathetic, you clearly to me are not a good diplomat. Universality of values. Simply, very simple. If you stand for values, and we see the Occidental world really standing for values, going to war for values, for their value systems, for human rights, for women's rights, for children's rights, for putting women in universities and schools in Afghanistan and then disappearing. Yeah? So universality requires you to have the same value system that you preserve within your geography outside of your geography. Killing is not okay in your geography. Killing better not be okay in other geographies also. Then I think a really big, and we all teach our children, we teach everyone, honesty, honesty, honesty. But what really is honesty? Honesty, to me, more than anything else, is to be real and honest about what worked and what did not work. And to really have the confidence and the ability to come out there and say, yes, the way we did the Afghanistan war did not really work. For India and Pakistan to come out and say that for 70 years, feeding our children, you know, hatred, animosity may not have been the best thing to do. It is being able to acknowledge, because if you're not going to be honest about what you've done and why you are where you are, how will you ever self-correct? You know, I think we should learn a lot from machines nowadays. There is a feature of auto-correction. That feature of auto-correction in humans is something which is again selective. You have to turn it on. It is not automatic. Then you have to have humility. And humility goes, you know, in tandem with honesty, because first you have to acknowledge, and then you have to have the humility to say, okay, what we did was wrong, let's correct it. If you're not going to have the humility to acknowledge mistakes, you will continue to be festered or to be condemned to repeat the same mistakes again and again and again. I remember when I was new at the Foreign Office, just learning the jargon back in 2010 and 11, and the nuances and everything. So I used to tell, you know, every time we would be having these internal meetings, so I would say, I am very happy to make new mistakes, but please let's not condemn ourselves to repeat the mistakes of the past. Let's learn from the past to go forward, not be, you know, not almost hold on to positions to the extent that yes, we are going to make the same mistakes again and again and again and not be able to learn from it. So that's humility. And then what I've already said, lessons from history. How can we not afford to learn lessons from history? History is a great teacher. History teaches us. Why did we come up with this great model that is being condemned everywhere about, you know, the world governance structures, about the United Nations, about WTO? All of those came after the conflict, which was, you know, yes, European, but after World War II, because everybody said no more to war. And now it has been far too long, and we seem to be yearning for wars and conflict and going full speed ahead, because we think diplomacy is now about win-win only. And that, to me, is a great feature of the world that we're living in today. Anger. And the demonstration of your anger is certainly not diplomacy. You know, I used to always say, if you want to be a good diplomat, leave your anger outside the door. Okay, because diplomacy, if you think, is a demonstration of your anger to the neighbor who's lesser off, tell them we will do this and we will block this and we will block that. That is not diplomacy. Diplomacy is being able to make them understand how both of us prosper if we're able to do what is best for the region. Then, if reconciliation and compromise are not words in the diplomatic playbook of a country or a people or a region, clearly, you can forget about calling yourself a diplomat. So if you're a propagator, I mean, the question is simple. Are you a propagator of disputes and conflict, or are you a resolver of this? This goes for countries, this goes for people, this goes for regions, and if we feel that we have become a propagator of conflict, I'm going to come to what I think is happening in the world, okay? Or maybe just before that, I'm just going to talk about 5 features which I think, or 3, which I think are really important, and then immediately go to the world. So one is credibility. You have to be credible. So you can't say one thing and do another thing. Often I think people think that what they say is far more important than what they do. I always say, people have ears, but they also have eyes. So when you say you stand for human values and you are okay with killing people right, left, and center as a consequence of your policy, you cannot be what you are. Predictability, you should be predictable. If you say you stand for something, you should be able to stand. Trust, are you a trustworthy ally, or are you a trustworthy opponent? And then, of course, I've already mentioned consistency. And believe me, I've seen many good diplomats in my lifetime. The very good diplomats live, eat, breathe diplomacy in some ways, because they're looking for solutions. They're always looking for solutions. Yes, they want to hold the interest of their country, but they want to hold the interest of the country in a way which is realistic, which is not a utopian world. The world is what it is. You can either deal with a world that is there, or you can imagine a world that you'd like and then keep on performing in an artificial world which doesn't really exist on paper. Now, coming to the world that we are living in today, and I think this is kind of interesting. I believe I'm just going to use very quickly some words to define the world that we're living in, right? This is, I believe, a world of unpeace, and anybody who wants to delve deeper into it, I invite you to read a book by Mark Leonard on this. This is a world of decoupling. So countries like ours who were told that let your industry die, but trade is the feature of the world. That's the only thing that can take us. And now we're talking about decoupling, and that seems to be the in vogue thing and the fashionable thing and the right thing to do. And I believe diplomacy today has been reduced to the tweets that leaders do, the press releases that leaders issue, and the statements that they issue. Diplomacy has been reduced to use your veto power of hegemonic powers to stop ceasefire, rather than the same powers working day and night to help create the path for ceasefire. To me, the only type of diplomacy is quiet diplomacy. And this is perhaps, if there's one thing you want to take from this talk, there is no such thing as the type of diplomacy that is conducted through statements and tweets. If you want something done, it has to be quiet diplomacy, which means you will never ever get out of the room with an adversary or a friend and tell the press what happened. You will always preserve their dignity, their honor, and their ability to walk back from the positions that they've taken, and that is called diplomacy. But if you want to just impress the world with the statements that you've made and how hard you were on the Taliban and how hard you were on that country, that will get you brownie points and maybe one day newsworthy, headlines. It is not going to get you anywhere. And we saw how all of that functioned, and we saw how we went repeatedly into wars and never had the time to look back as to what were the consequences in the geography where the wars were conducted. So you see, when wars are conducted in the geography that is not yours, it's very easy to move away. We happen to be coming from a geography or belong to a geography where too many wars have happened, both big ones and small ones. And conflict has been almost part of daily life. And I think it is really wise for us to ask ourselves the question that in the wars that were conducted in the name of peace, in the name of progress, in the name of development, in the name of sending girls to school, how much of that have we achieved? I don't have the time to give you hard numbers, but once, as a foreign minister, I went to Brussels and I was able to share numbers of how many bombs were there in Pakistan, suicide bomb attacks before the Great War started in Afghanistan to give us development and progress and take out extremism. And what was the state of extremism pre the 9/11 wars, and what has been the state of extremism post? However, we do not have the humility or the honesty to be able to delve into the impact of what we've done. And I promise to end at a good note and give you 2 names that you should all remember. And I'm going to come to that. I need to just go back. All of you have heard of this gentleman called Arshad Nadeem? Good. Have you heard of this lady two ladies, one by the name of Razia Parveen and one by the name of Saroj Devi. Razia Parveen and Saroj Devi are the diplomats of today. Okay? We have all lived in an environment where we have jealously preserved animosity and conflict with our neighbor who looks like us, speaks like us, lives in the same geography, eats like us. When we go abroad, becomes our best friends as people, right? But we have both countries preserved jealously the need to create animosity and adversarial relationship and teach children. My child came up to me and said, India is our enemy. I said, who told you India is our enemy? And he said, no, everybody says India is our enemy, they should die, etc. I'm like, this is what we teach our children. And I was like, in my house? So it was really instructive for me that this is what we are teaching our children. I decided when I reached the Foreign Office that we will stop calling India. I will go back to the two ladies. Razia Parveen, when she was asked about her son's victory, said, Neeraj Chopra is like a son to me, I prayed for him too. And in Urdu she said, Mushkil aati hai jati hai, inshallah, wo bhi tamga lega. What does it take for a woman to say that of the adversary or the competitor of her own son who made it on his own grit? Anyone wants to take credit, and everybody and their godfathers want to take credit. He made it on his own grit. And his mother is saying, the other one, inshallah zarur tamga lega, and he's like my son, and I prayed for him too. And guess what the other woman said, Saroj Devi, the mother of the adversary. When she was asked, she said, are you happy with your son's silver? She said, my child Arshad Nadeem bagged the gold. Okay? And for me, हम बहुत खुश हैं, हमें silver भी gold जैसा लगता है. Okay? Now this is what diplomacy is. When you give it a fight, you give it a negotiate, you go to the negotiating table, you there to preserve your country's interest, but you're able to understand that you have to give it a fair fight. And the other one wins, give him the success, accolades that he deserves. So really, the message is, we are experiencing the moment of the death of diplomacy. If this continues at this stage, I think our children are going to be living in a far worse world than the one that we inhabited.